Hi, everybody. This is the last rough cut of the academic year, so thank you all for coming, and thank you for joining rough cuts throughout the last semesters. Pleased to have Marco Maneta here from University of Montana. He's a associate professor of hydrology and hydrologic modeling, and I think many of you know him and have worked with him. He got his PhD from the University of Extremadura, Spain, on integrated physics-based hydrologic modeling for semi-arid rangelands in Spain, I guess.
In Spain.
Yeah, and then he did a postdoc at UC Davis on the interactions between hydrology and agriculture in tropical regions. And now he says his research focuses on three broad topics. One is understanding the interaction between hydrologic, climate, and ecological processes from the perspective of water. The second is looking at the impacts of natural disturbance and human activity as they get propagated through the environment. And the third, which I guess is what you're talking about today, is developing advanced analytical tools to study water and drought in agricultural regions. And he's working with people here and DNRC on a new project to do that in Montana. So thank you for coming and welcome.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for attending this rough cut seminar. It's always great coming and visiting here at MSU. So what I'm going to, I'm going to give you an overview today of a couple of collaborative projects that are interrelated and got recently funded, focused on developing that next generation of tools that will provide water managers with analytical capabilities to understand how climate variations will impact water use and agricultural productivity. The cool thing about these projects are that they're truly interdisciplinary, and this one involves a very diverse team of people from MSU and UM. So it involves the two major research institutions here in Montana. It involves also collaborators at Virginia Tech. It involves the state water management agencies, and the team is composed by hydrologists, climatologists, agronomists, remote sensing specialists, economists. So it's a big operation. It's all geared toward understanding how droughts and climate variability might threaten water and food security. And needless to say that agriculture is an important sector in Montana's economy. So both livestock and crops bring or contribute over $2 billion annually to Montana's GDP and employs tens of thousands of people. So it's critical for rural livelihoods. And a feature of Montana's agriculture is that even though irrigation is expanding, most of agriculture in Montana is mostly rain-fed, and therefore it's very exposed to climate variability and to drought. So the situation in the Southwest with the drought in the last few years and the flash drought that we've had this past year in Montana has been a bit of a wake-up call for our water managers to see, well, you know, like, are we safe, or is our food production system safe? So I'm presenting here some analysis that we've done with some of our remote sensing products on that flash drought and see the peculiarities of it. So what we see here is the anomaly in production, plant production for different land uses in Montana and in the northern plains for different land uses, 2016 with respect to 2017. And last year, as this year, we had a very wet spring. It was an awesome spring, and what we see is that production was higher by 20 to 30 and over 30% higher than what it was in 2016. But then at some point around June, precipitation stopped and production collapsed. But it didn't collapse in all uses the same. So broadleaf crops and cereal crops collapsed to have a negative anomaly toward the end of the growing season. But forests were actually keeping up quite well. And the reason for this is that this flash drought was extremely circumscribed geographically to this region here in eastern Montana. So what we see in this map is the readings in soil moisture from a remote sensing sensor from SMAP. The brown colors indicate a negative anomaly, indicating drier regions here in the serial, in the region where Montana's agriculture is concentrated. This map here shows a translation of soil moisture to primary productivity, and those purple colors indicate a depression in production. Now, in the mountain regions, we have greens indicating lots of production. So our forests were doing quite well, but this region here and the Dakotas were taking the blunt of the flash drought. So the spatial location matters, and droughts sometimes they are having a very large extent. Sometimes they're more circumscribed. So the impact on the hydrologic system is also especially variable. So for this, the flash drought is an episodic event. It might happen or not again, but our climatologists and the Montana Climate Assessment is projecting that we're going to see actually a decrease in the amount of precipitation and an increase in the amount of temperatures in the growing season. Those graphs show the projections for the business as usual scenario for different regions in Montana here for all the months, and the trends in precipitation on top and on temperature here. And what we see is that these 10 colors indicate a decline in precipitation from June through September for most regions, which is the bulk of the growing season. So there is a redistribution of precipitation, which might affect agriculture. And this is compounded by an expected increase in the temperature, which might increase the thermal stress of our crops. So in order to understand how those projected impacts will actually impact our food production and our food security, we have been developing a family of models called hydroeconomic models. And hydroeconomic models are a branch of models that couple a hydrologic model to an economic model of agricultural production. So this hydrologic model provides the physical constraints to production, the amount of water the farmers have available at the diversion point, the amount of groundwater that is available, the amount of precipitation. The agroeconomic model of agricultural production simulates production and simulates the decisions that farmers make when they're running their farm operations. So this is a type of models that has been very widely used by agricultural water managers in many regions in the world to answer questions like this, like how does agricultural change impact water availability and other water users? It can also answer questions like how farmers respond to different water policies, to agricultural markets, and to the farmer's perception of climate. And sometimes climate doesn't need to change for farmers to change their behavior if they feel that next year is going to be drier than what they expect. So this figure here is super busy. Probably you cannot see it, but it's a standard structure of a hydroeconomic model. And what we have is a hydroclimatic model that provides those physical constraints, the amount of precipitation available, groundwater available, surface water available to farmers at the diversion point. Then we have an agroeconomic model that uses this information to calculate how much crop farmers are going to produce under those physical constraints and also under policy constraints, water rights, and then the market constraints. And it produces, that gives information about the amount of production, the reallocation of resources, the crops that farmers decide to grow, and this is fed back to the hydrologic model. So if we know if we can calculate how much water farmers are diverting, it feeds back into the hydrologic model. So this agricultural activity gets propagated to the downstream users. So if there is no water right, downstream users are going to see a decrease in the water availability if upstream users have been intensifying their diversions. So water managers then can use this kind of modeling system to simulate how some users are going to impact other users and the different policy scenarios, different agricultural market scenarios, and so on and so forth, with whatever objective they're trying to achieve. So I'm going to give you now an example of a study that we conducted in the past using this type of modeling so you get an idea of the capabilities. So what we did is we ran a very sophisticated hydrologic model that simulates the three-dimensional hydrologic structure of an agricultural basin. And what we have here is a model that couples together the governing equations to simulate water flow in channels and in in the surface and in the groundwater system. So we can calculate at any point in time how much water is available at the diversion point and how deep the groundwater table is to calculate water availability to farmers. So this model is coupled to an economic model of agricultural production. And the backbone of this type of models is typically this net revenue function. And the big assumption that is made is that farmers allocate resources, land and water and fertilizer, in order to maximize their net revenues. So the calculation of net revenues is done by calculating first the gross revenues, which come from multiplying the price P that farmers get paid for each product J that they grow, like it can be alfalfa, wheat, it can be corn, whatever, times the amount of production of this product. And the amount of production is given by a production function that is embedded in this function Q. This production function is an empirical function that depends on some parameters that need to be calibrated, and this matrix X that embeds the decision variables, the factors that farmers can control to run their operation. So here we're controlling the amount of land, the amount of crops that they grow, that they choose to grow, like alfalfa, corn, whatever, the amount of land that they allocate to each of these crops, the amount of water that they allocate, fertilizer, seeds, labor, and so on. We can pick what we want. Now, when you apply water to crops, the production goes up at each unit that you apply, but the marginal returns go decreasing. There is a moment that you apply more water and you're not really getting a whole lot of more production. This, the application has a cost, which is the second part of the net revenue function. So you have the gross revenues. Every time you apply water or you cultivate more land, there is costs associated. So this X matrix with factors appear also in the cost function, indicating that as you're applying more inputs, your costs go up. There is a moment that the return that you're getting from applying additional units of inputs equal the cost. In that moment, you are maximizing your net revenues. If you apply an additional unit of water that costs money, it might cost you more than the actual revenue that you're getting back. You should stop applying. So one of the connections with the hydrologic model in this system is that this maximization is constrained to the physical availability of land and water, which is provided here. So the hydrologic model says this is the amount of water you have, maximize given these constraints, right? So once the model is calibrated, and calibration means, we'll get back to this, putting value to those Greek letters, these tau, these betas, these rhos. So those parameters represent eventually the behavior of farmers. So once those parameters are calibrated, we can run this model to understand how farmers react to different scenarios. So we're running this model in this watershed that has a system that is very similar to the system in Montana. So we have a mix of farmers, some of them ranchers that grow pasture for livestock. We have smaller operations that have some irrigation going. And I'm going to show you a simulation. Let's see if it works. A simulation. How do that?
Get up where you're at. And then bottom.
Share screen. Yeah, there we go. And then no, that's not what I want. Here, we're sharing the screen. Yeah, so what we see here is this watershed. And the watershed has a stream that runs from the south towards the north. And it has two reservoirs, one located upstream, one located downstream. Some farmers take water from the groundwater system, some farmers take water from the reservoir system. What we're going to see now is that the simulation is at the end of the rainy season. The basin is going to get drier. Green and blue colors indicate wet, yellow and red colors indicate dry. We're going to see the basin drying. At some point, the farmers are going to turn on the center pivots. We're going to see that some of the center pivots are supplied by groundwater, and we can calculate how the groundwater is affected, and it's going to start generating a depression cone that we can calculate, that we can simulate to calculate how the increased depth to the groundwater is given the extraction by some farmers might affect neighboring farmers and the extraction area of that depression cone. So for each point in the landscape, we know the soil moisture is getting dry. We're going to see the center pivots going. And now we're going to see here how the groundwater table is being depressed and it's generating the capture area. We can see that the activity of some farmers to irrigate actually does propagate in space to impact the options of other farmers. The hydrologic system impacts or propagates the choices, the economic choices that farmers make. The physical system propagates this kind of decisions and determine the options that all the farmers have. And this is something very important that our model captures. So to summarize, we have 4 types of farmers. This farmer here that is indicated with that hatch line, it's a large farmer, mostly grain-fed, grows pasture to feed cattle, but has 2 center pivots that we've seen operating that take water from wells here. Farmer number 2 is also a largish rancher, mostly rain-fed too, that has only 1 small center pivot to irrigate. And this center pivot is supplied by water from reservoir number 5 that is located downstream. And then we have other 2 farmers. Farmer number 3, which is this guy here, that is a small farmer, very diversified, mostly irrigated, that takes water from reservoir number 2, which is located upstream. And then we have a collection of farmers here. They're small, mostly subsistence farmers that are under a government program that has been building wells for them so they can use groundwater. Each of those dots is a well in their properties. And they can also take water from reservoir number 5. Now, taking water from the reservoir is free. It is diverted. But if there's no water, they might resort to pumping subsurface water, but it has a cost, the cost of pumping. When they turn on the pump, electricity bills go up, right? So they choose first here, and only when they don't have water here, they turn on the pumps. So we've run the hydrologic model, and we know the water that is available. We know for a baseline scenario what it is that they do to calibrate our model. So now we can ask questions like, how do farmers behave under a drought? So we calibrate a model for the precipitation and ET conditions in 2004. That was a typical year for those farmers. And then we say, hey, let's simulate what farmers would do if they know that there's going to be a 40% less precipitation. So they're going to have a 40% precipitation shortfall and a 20% increase in atmospheric demand. And we're going to go first to the hydrologic impacts. What we see here is the states of the 2 reservoirs. Reservoir number 2 upstream, reservoir number 5 downstream. The squiggly lines is the volume stored in the reservoir. The straighter lines is the water that is being diverted from the reservoir. The black line is the baseline scenario, and the red line is the drought scenario. And what we see is that during the rainy season, the reservoir is full. They don't need to irrigate, so that they're not diverting water. They grow a crop. They supplement at the end of the rainy season with some water to finish up this crop. And then they grow a second crop that is fully irrigated. During the baseline scenario, they take about 80 cubic meters per hour to irrigate from the reservoir. During the drought scenario, they irrigate more, as we're going to see. They extract as much as they can, and they do not have a big impact. They still take less water, but they take it at 78 cubic meters per hour. So they have most of the water that they need, but they end up drying at the end of the season, drying the reservoir. So they're in good shape. Now the reservoirs that depend, the farmers that depend on the reservoir downstream, they have a whole different situation. So during the rainy season, they grow, even during the drought, they can grow the crop. They supplement at the end of the rainy season. But the second crop, they require about 38 cubic meters per hour during the baseline scenario. Now, during the drought, they only have 25% of this water available because those guys have been intensifying water use. So now, the guys that depend on this reservoir, they have a problem, except if they can access groundwater. So what happens to groundwater? What we see here is the amount of water applied per source. This is basically the percent of groundwater that is being used in irrigation. So let's focus here. During the baseline scenario, which is this dotted line, they did not need to use groundwater because they had the water that they needed from the reservoir. Now, during the drought, they supplement up to 20% with groundwater because they have this option, some of the farmers. And that we're going to see buffer the impact of a drought big time. They do that even though they need to fetch the water from deeper. So during the drought, the depth to the groundwater table increases. We can calculate the depth to the groundwater table from all the wells and see if some of the wells actually are not able, so the water table actually goes below the well and is not available. So this is the hydrologic impact in the water that they have available. So what is the implications for farmers? And farmers adjust and say, oh my gosh, there's a precipitation shortfall. How do they allocate their resources? And the main resources is the allocation of water and land. And what we see here is percent change in allocation of resources to the different crops that they grow in this region with respect to the baseline. The first thing that they do is that they reallocate the applied water. Farmers that have less access to water reduce the water to the least profitable crops, or the ones that have less, that are more resilient to stress irrigation. And this is corn and dry beans and a lot of wheat. Farmer number 3 that has access to the reservoir actually sees less precipitation coming, intensifies irrigation. So it irrigates more the corn, it irrigates more the limes and the veggies and the orchard. So less precipitation, intensification in irrigation. The other thing that they do is they reallocate land. So this is all the crops. D indicates dry land crops. I here indicates irrigated crops. The farmers that have irrigation, 3 and 4, they reduce their pasture, which is dry land, and reallocate this water to irrigating higher value crops. The farmers that do not have access to much water, they reduce the area in soybeans and they reallocate some of the land to whatever water they have and whatever water they have to more profitable crops, corn and beans and a little bit of irrigated wheat here and some sorghum. So this is to increase the profits. They can also try to increase net revenues by decreasing costs. And what they do is they hire less people because they reduce the area allocated to pasture. So they need less people working in pastures and in soybeans, and they reallocate some of this labor to other crops. But yeah, of course, it has implications for the local economy. So in here, what we see is like the change in profit per crop, and what we see is that there is a large decrease in profit returned by pasture and corn, and all those crops are, of course, they're planting less area and they're producing less. But this is partially compensated by an increase in profits from other crops here, mostly irrigated crops. So we can do this analysis for different levels of precipitation shortfalls: 20% drought, 40% decrease in precipitation, 50%. The important thing here is that the location of farmers with respect to the water resources makes a big change, makes a big difference on how they're impacted and how they weather precipitation reductions. So farmer number 3 and farmer number 4, there are smaller, highly diversified farmers with access to groundwater and surface water. They actually weather quite well droughts of severe intensity. Farmer 1 and 2, they're hit harder because they have less access to water and to irrigation, and they're less diversified. They're mostly pasture land and grass farmers. So the take homes is that if we are going to understand how the agricultural system works, we need to take into account the spatial distribution of farmers with respect to the water sources, right? So the way different farmers will respond depends on the physical constraints. So it needs to be provided by a hydrologic model. We also learned that the way farmers react actually can buffer or exacerbate the effect of a drought and worsen the situation for farmers downstream if there is no proper policy in place. If there is no water rights and whoever gets the water first uses it, worsens the situation for downstream farmers because the impact of agricultural operations in the hydrologic system propagate in the hydrologic network. So hydroeconomic models are very useful to choose between different policy alternatives that can be used to promote agricultural adaptation and a fair share of water resources. And we can simulate those and choose the best one. The other thing is that human and ecologic impacts, or agroecologic, add a lot of complexity to the hydrologic response. We cannot understand the impact of climate change or drought if we only look at the physical factors. We need to introduce in our models the human behavior and how humans use water resources. And humans are a part of the hydrologic cycle as plants are. So this is all great. And those are methods that are very popular. The calibration is done using mathematical programming techniques, but they're mostly circumscribed to use in smaller regions, pilot regions, because those are expensive models to run. To calibrate the models, you need to have information on how farmers allocate resources during the baseline scenarios, and you need to conduct surveys. And surveys are expensive. You need to send people with questionnaires, run them to all the farms in the region. You can do it some years, but not every year. So the fact that we can only survey some specific years, and not all farmers respond, only some specific type of farmers respond, introduces biases associated with inadequate sampling. The farmers that typically respond to surveys are farmers that are more receptive to science or to talk to the university, and they might not be representative of the behavior of other farmers that might be more reluctant. So there is this bias associated with inadequate sampling. We can also overfit the models to the conditions of the sample year. Maybe that year the farmers did very well, and when we are running a drought, or 10 years later when we're running the simulation, we're using a model that might be overfitted for the years where the survey was conducted. The other big problem is that those models are deterministic in nature. They provide one number of how much water farmers are going to use, how much land they're going to allocate, that provides a false sense of precision to decision makers. So that is something that needs to be addressed, and so we can incorporate the uncertainty that we have in our observations and in our models. So in our projects, we are taking this kind of tools one step forward by leveraging remote sensing. So Earth observation systems, in conjunction with new data simulation technologies based on stochastic methods, permit to overcome many of the shortcomings and challenges that we just discussed. For one thing, new remote sensing methods and technologies are allowing us to observe agricultural activity over large extents at unprecedented spatial and temporal resolutions. This is something that until very recently has not been possible and has been hampering the use of remote sensing for this type of uses. Because we have now every year information on how farmers allocate land and water, all the farmers, not only the ones that want to reply, we have a more unbiased sampling of agricultural activity. And we have it every year. We're not overfitting out of the conditions of one specific year. Now, granted, remote sensing is noisier than surveys in that there is a number of factors that impact the way we actually characterize this agricultural activity. But this noise is actually very well, it's very well documented in the remote sensing products. Our data simulation algorithms can use this information and propagate this uncertainty toward the solutions that our models give. So when we're making a solution, we know that we're making it with a level of probability that can be used for the risk analysis assessment. So the other thing that our stochastic methods can do is, over time, they learn and filter out the noise in the remote sensing and are able to pick up the signal from all the noise if we give it sufficient time for the algorithm to operate. So bear with me with that slide for a second, because this is the key of the method. So how do we incorporate remote sensing information to calibrate recursively the models that simulate farmer behavior? So we said that farmers operate to maximize their net revenues. So if we take the derivative of the net revenue function, and we know that when the first derivative is 0, you're reaching a maximum, right? So this is the first order optimality condition. Under the assumption of the farmers allocating with the hope that they're maximizing their net revenue, we can say, well, we take the derivative, calculate the first order optimality conditions, and what this is giving us is the derivative of the net revenue of the gross revenues is the marginal revenues. The derivative of the cost is the marginal cost. When they are equal, we are optimal. If we can observe what farmers have done in the past, and we say this is optimal because they are, at least they think it's optimal, we can pin the factors in matrix X to the observed factors. And we can ask our programming method, hey, give me the parameters of my production function that are embedded here in that Greek letter theta is a vector of all the parameters. Give me the parameters that solve this equality. What we're doing is saying, okay, we're maximizing this function under observed constraints such that those parameters represent the maximum net revenues under the observed allocation. So this calibrates a model. Now, what we're doing is, with a Kalman filter, is we are sampling randomly parameters and finding the ones that actually solve this equality in a way that is recursive. And over time, we're getting a distribution of parameters, the one that most likely solve this equation, but also providing an information of how these observations of allocation affect our understanding of those parameters. Bear with me and see if it becomes clear in a second. So now, because we're using remote sensing, the observations of resource allocation in agriculture that we can observe are only the ones that we can observe from satellite. And this is, we can study how farmers allocate land, how farmers allocate water, what crops they decide to grow, and we can also observe the crop yields to calculate their net revenues. We cannot observe how they allocate fertilizer, how they allocate labor. They have to come from other sources. But yeah, so what we need then is observations of the crop mix, the land they allocate, the crop yields, and the water use. So the crop mix and the allocation is obtained from the Cropland data layer. And this is already an operational product that the USDA is maintaining. And it's a satellite-based reclassification of all the crops that is released every year in January for the crops of the previous year. And that is telling us since 2008 for all the conterminous US, but from 1997 in some selected areas, what's the acreage for all the crops for the entire conterminous US. It is done at a very high resolution, 30 meters, and it focuses on all major crops in the US or in the conterminous US, released in January. So every January, you know what farmers have grown and how much acreage for the previous year. So this is an example of the Cropland data layer for 2014 for Montana. You might recognize the outline here. And here is the wheat and barley region. This is in Montana. You can see, they're growing all these different crops. If we single out Ravalli County, which is south of Missoula, we can do a cross-section of all the crops for all the years that we have available and calculate the acreage of the different crops. This is the biggest crops, alfalfa and pastures. And we can see the acreage changing over time. And then we have a bunch of other smaller crops like barley, corn, spring wheat happening there, but to a smaller extent. So we have this information already that we can start ingesting in our model. So the other factors, water and crop yield, come from a product that we've been developing lately by fusing Moody's and Landsat. So Moody's and Landsat have features that are, to some extent, they work very well together. Moody's has been used in agriculture, but its use has been limited because it doesn't have enough resolution. So Moody's, or the NDVI product of Moody's, runs every 8 days, which is sufficient for agricultural applications, but the resolution is 250 meters, a little too coarse for some smaller fields. On the other hand, Landsat has really good spatial resolution at 30 meters, but it only goes twice a month. So if you have clouds in one of the passes, you have 1 month with no information on the state of the crops. So fusing those two sensors has been it's complicated. It has been done, but now with the Google Earth Engine framework, we can do all the operations to geometrically correct and line up all the images provide the atmospheric corrections, and run fusion algorithms to obtain time series of greening of vegetation every 8 days at 30-meter resolution. So we can capture the phenology of the crop. So this is an example of a Landsat image for a region in Montana for the NDVI. We can see some clouds here, 30-meter. Here is the MODIS 250, close to that date with no clouds. When we merge them, we get a fusion of 30-meter. We filter out the clouds. We can see the phenology of the crops. So if we obtain every 8 days the greening of the crop, we can get the phenology of most of the crops grown around. This is an example around Flathead Lake. But again, NDVI is not yield, is not crop production. So we run an algorithm that uses NDVI and transforms that together with photosynthetically active radiation and other information into actual yield. So after we run this algorithm, we can obtain how the plant has been growing, the primary production in grams of carbon uptaken by the plant over the season. This is an example for alfalfa and spring wheat at a level of resolution where we can see the center pivots, we can see the fields, what fields are doing, what part of the field is doing better, which part of the field is doing worse. If we integrate the total production and we know the ratio between the biomass to yield, we can calculate the actual yield. And when we do this, I'm presenting here the calculation that we have done for barley in 2010 for all the counties in Montana that are growing barley, and compare that to the yield and to the USDA estimate. So the green line is the USDA estimate for barley, and the darker line is our estimate, and we're actually doing a pretty decent job in being able to see from remote sensing the yield. So we have the yield, we have the acreage, we have the crops that they grow. The next thing is the amount of water. So, and to calculate the water that farmers are applying, we're assuming that we have a function that relates the NDVI observed from satellite to the crop coefficient that indicates what is the percentage or what's the fraction of the atmospheric demand that the plant is meeting. And if we assume that farmers do not irrigate when it rains, so then we get the total water requirements for the crop. Now we divide this by an irrigation efficiency factor that takes into account the irrigation technology. So the irrigation is never 100%. So if you're using a center pivot, you're applying a little bit more water. If you're using flat irrigation, or if you're using macro sprinklers, the efficiency is different. So the amount of water extracted is higher typically, or is always higher than what is actually demanded by the plant. This irrigation value is what is being applied in the model in the field, and is what is being extracted from the stream network in the hydrologic model. So now, the system is rather complicated, and we're not expecting that our partners, DNRC, are going to do all the fusion, all the merging, all the calibration, all the filtering. So our system is designed with a structure that's a client-server kind of connection. We encapsulate away all the complexities of processing the remote sensing and calibrating the models in a server that is located at the university. So the servers take information from the remote sensing, does the fusion, calculates the crop yields, calculates the acreage from the Cropland Data layer, takes all the climate scenarios. So when the water managers want to use our system, they have a client, and this is how it looks as of today. So they can type the address of the server here, they connect to it, and then they can retrieve whatever network is stored in the server. They can do the Montana network. It displays here, each red dot is a point where water is being diverted, is being calculated by the hydrologic model. Blue dots are water users. They have those diversion channels, and there's a bunch of information here that they can query. They can also download different climate scenarios from the IPCC, CEMIP 5, different economic scenarios, different policy scenarios, and they can upload their own here too, and then download information, and there's a way to interact. But they connect to the server, they don't need to deal with nothing. They just get the calibrated value of the parameters, and they just run it with their different policy scenarios. So what it is that the server is doing, with all this stuff that we've been talking about so far. So the server takes information on runs the hydrologic model for the years, provide the constraints to the agroeconomic model and to the hydrologic model. We're taking the satellite data. We're taking some ancillary data on labor prices of crops and so on. Our algorithm, that's the work. And what it is that is happening. These are those Greek letters. Those are the function parameters that need to be calibrated. And every year that we have remote sensing, information is what I call here an assimilation cycle. And what we see here is how the model goes correcting and providing the parameters that solve this equation recursively. So those parameters are the ones that solve the optimality conditions. The red line is the optimal, the most likely parameter is the mean of the parameters that represent the behavior with respect to alfalfa and wheat and for each region. The gray lines is the probability distribution. And what we see is the model in a few cycles converges to the two parameters, but also give us an information on how uncertain we are about that calibrated value. So for this sigma parameter on this top, the uncertainty is large. The tau parameter has smaller uncertainty. Those beta parameters have different kind of uncertainties. When we're running our model forward, this uncertainty gets propagated to the predictions. How does it do that? The model runs forward, and we can query the model. Give me the allocation that we have for the baseline scenarios that I know, where farmers have done. And for a specific region, we can say reproduce the baseline observations. And the model is going to say, well, in that region, for land, and the land is the top row, and water is the bottom row. And for these different crops, this is what farmers are going to do. This is the probability distribution that they're going to allocate this amount of land to alfalfa, to wheat, or to corn. And this is the amount of water that probably they're going to apply. And if we compare that to the observations, we see that the model is nicely calibrated. The probability is centered around the observations. The model, the calibration does its job. It does a very good job. We can use this uncertainty to calculate the risk of not acting to this water use, even though it's less likely, but it's still highly likely, right? And do a risk assessment of choosing only the most likely scenario versus other scenarios that might be less likely, but also important. So if we have confidence of how the model works, we can run different alternatives. So here I'm simulating a new allocation rule in which water rights have been reallocated upstream, and our hydrologic model says that this region now, under one scenario, has 30% less water available, and under another more stringent scenario, we have 50% less water available. How would the model simulate that? What the model is telling us is, well, so here now the blue distribution is the 30% restriction scenario. The green distribution is the more stringent water availability scenario. And what we're seeing here now is the probability of change with respect to the baseline. The red line is 0% change, is the baseline. And here we have like a decline, a negative percent. What we see is that when those farmers in this region have 30% less water, they choose to not to reallocate land. They still pretty much grow the same acreage for those crops. What they do is they allocate less water. They decide to stress irrigate instead of reduce the allocation. And they stress irrigate more alfalfa than, say, wheat or the other crop because it might have a higher value for them. When you restrict the water more, yeah, they now need to react and say, hey, you know, I cannot plant as much alfalfa or wheat as I wanted. Now there is a reduction in the acreage allocated to the crops, and a reallocation of the water, which also has to be reduced because, of course, there is less land allocated. So we can see how farmers are going to react. But not only this, we can see how those reductions affect the other users downstream and propagate this analysis along the river network. We can also calculate the value that water has for them and the impact in their net revenue. So here in the baseline scenario, farmers have about 2,300 acre-feet of water available. And they only use a little bit over 2,000 because they didn't need more. They let the water run down the stream. So if you ask the farmer, hey, if I give you an additional unit of water, what would you pay for it? And they would say, I would pay $0 because I had the water and I let it run. When they get to the 30% reduction scenario, the water available to them now is only 1,600 acre-feet. Now they use it all. Water becomes binding for them. They hit that constraint, that physical constraint. Now, if you were to ask the farmers, hey, if I give you another unit of water, how much would you be willing to pay? Our model calculates the opportunity cost, which is how much money they are not making per unit water. So it's the money that they would say, well, if I had this unit of water, I would be making $9 more per unit of water. This is what I would be willing to pay. And we can also calculate the change in the total net revenues in the farming operations, right? And for that region, there will be, for a 30% reduction, less than 3% impact in the net revenue. For the 50% reduction, they only have 1,100 acre-feet. The value of water goes up because now each value of water would increase the net revenue much higher, so they would be willing to pay more. And the impact, of course, in the local economy is higher. Now they have over 11% less revenue with respect to the baseline scenario. So this is very important because this information is something that water managers are interested to see where water has more value that can be used perhaps to articulate water markets or to articulate other things that our economists might help us with and policymakers. It also helps us inform, get additional information of if you are gonna, to guide investment, if you're gonna recommend investment, where the water has more value and where it would be important to develop new water sources and where would be less important, right? And of course, we will be able to propagate the impact of droughts to see how a drought that is impacting maybe some specific region in Montana and how the intensification of water use there is going to affect other regions that might not be directly impacted by the drought, but that the hydrologic effects, you know, are propagated through the physical hydrologic system. This is something that we can do. So just to wrap up, hydroeconomic models are becoming one of the most important tools to manage agricultural water in regions, in agricultural regions. It's extensively used to drive water policy in California, in Europe. It's huge. And it is helping anticipate the imbalances that they are seeing that will happen between the water supply and the water demand. And sometimes to have an imbalance, you don't have to have a precipitation shortfall. It's just like an intensification of agricultural activity toward products that are more water, that demand more water. So if we incorporate hydroeconomic models within a data simulation framework that can ingest remote sensing, we're actually overcoming many of the current limits of hydroeconomic decision support systems, and we're bringing this modeling framework into the future, and we are pioneering this advance. So those tools are truly state of the art, and hopefully will make a difference. So because we don't rely on surveys, it's a very cost-effective approach to have those tools not only for research, but for operational water management over large regions, statewide. We are not only circumscribed to research projects in small pilot watersheds. So that's also very, very important. Something that I haven't discussed, but is also critical, is that because we're simulating every year, and this is an operational product, if farmers adapt, if extension services work with them and they learn to operate better, we will be able to detect those changes by a drift in those parameters that represent farmers' behavior over time. So we'll be able to see what regions are changing the way they operate their agricultural operations and which regions are not, right? Just by looking at how those parameters change over time. And finally, because of the connection, the strong connection of a physical model that brings hydroclimatology and the water and a simulation of the entire water redistribution network, we can evaluate the downstream impacts of new water allocations, the spatial distribution of the relative value of agricultural water, and be able to play those what-if scenarios that will help us guide better policy that will strengthen and provide resilience to our agricultural system under projected environmental change. So with this, I'm happy to take questions. So there is a website for the project. Please go and if you're interested, take the updates. And we will be rolling soon a preliminary the code for this model and a preliminary version of this decision support system if you want to inspect it. And then, of course, information on our remote sensing products and so on and so forth. Twitter, we don't tweet much, but we hope in the future we will provide information through Twitter on updates. Yep. Jack.
That was fantastic. Have you considered experimenting model scenarios where the individual farmers are not selfish actors, but you place it sort of in a game theoretic context where there's different scenarios of cooperation versus
Yeah. This is one of the excellent. Yes, so this is one of the so there is models that do this that have this kind of approach. Sometimes farmers are not focused on increasing net revenue. They might be good actors. Sometimes they are risk averse. They say, I know how to maximize my net revenues, but I don't want to put all the eggs in one basket. There's modifications in our algorithm to take this risk aversion into account. But that thing that you just said on being cooperative actors is something that is harder to implement. The way to do it is with using agent-based modeling. But the problem with agent-based models is that they're computationally very, very expensive. And they're really hard to implement operationally over large regions. And this is why we made the choice of this type of models to represent farmers' behavior. But yeah, we will be able to assess, though, the cooperating attitude of farmers by looking at the difference between our simulations with our assumptions with what they actually do in reality. And this difference is either the risk aversion character or the cooperative character. So it's the difference as the error in our bias in our model.
I think mine's kind of a follow-up then. So, so if you take the simple path to say that they're going to be optimizing their net revenue, then your model results must be fairly sensitive to what that market price is. And how do you deal with the uncertainties and the dynamics of market price in your modeling?
Yeah. So market prices, they're input. They're an input to the model, and those are obtained from there's different sources. We're using the USDA estimates. We're assuming that farmers are Markovian agents that they don't. I mean, unless they're playing futures, and sometimes they do, but they planned with the prices that they received last season in mind, one season of memory. So, and we are doing some analysis to see how agricultural markets impact their decision with a longer-term memory. And what we've been finding out, and this is a statistical analysis, is that if you are analyzing the impact of agriculture looking purely at climatic factors, and you do not take into account those sensitivity to market factors, you overestimate the impact that climate will have on agricultural production. So prices go up, farmers will have capital to invest in better seeds, hire more labor, they start putting irrigation on, so you have precipitation shortfalls, but production might remain resilient because of their sensitivity to prices. So the assumption is that farmers are Markovian, they remember the prices that they received 1 year back.
So the choices that farmers are making, your X's, those are all made at different time with different time horizons. So, whether or not to turn on the pivots is a daily decision, but which crop to plant is either an annual or maybe a multi-annual decision.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that difference in time horizon, and in particular, when you make the assumption that farmers are always kind of choosing the optimal mix of those decisions, that some of those ex post may not have turned out to have been optimal?
Yeah, well, yeah, excellent. Yes, so I see two questions there. One of them is what happens to decisions that are made on terms that are longer than 1 year, alfalfa, for instance, or fruit like trees. You just kind of move them away, right? So we handle this by putting additional constraints. So if you choose to have, there's not a whole lot of fruit trees here. Montana is a simpler case, but in other regions I've worked on, cherries are important, almonds, walnuts. This is a constraint. Once we observe that they have this kind of crops there is a constraint that they cannot move this land. So they do not. It's land that is allocated to this type of crop for a time horizon. So they cannot put crops in this land. This becomes as a land constraint. Regarding the second question that was related to the allocation of water. The crop mix and the land allocation happens earlier in the season, and you commit to it. But the allocation of water is something that is done on a day-to-day basis. The way we handle this is we say, well, you commit to an acreage for a crop, but then you might decide that you just don't want to spend more money irrigating it. You're going to let it fail, or you're not going to collect it. The hydrologic model provides this information through that stress irrigation. And what we are doing is we're saying the crop requirement is calculated for that crop for the entire season. But because we can calculate the crop coefficient as a function of the NDVI, we prorate the optimal amount of water and the extractions I think we're doing weekly, not daily, and do those type of extractions to see how much water is being diverted. Now, the assumption is if the farmers decide to make the crop fail, this is not technically, so the model assumes that they will continue irrigating, and there will be an error that the model will have, and they will have to correct it for the next season. The model will learn, oh yeah, if there is no precipitation or no water, this is the crop that is going to produce less. It's going to produce less, and we're observing from remote sensing that it's less green, that it's using less water. So the model readapt and say, okay, when things get tough, this is the crop that is going to take the heat, and the reallocation go to a different crop. So the model needs cycles to learn. But yeah, so it's handled indirectly, and we're still testing how well the model does with this. And then there was a third question that I cannot remember.
Well, it's I think you touched on it, but the question of you made the comment that you're assuming that kind of the input mix is optimal, and you can use that to calibrate your parameters. And so the question was ex post, what if it turns out that was a really bad decision?
Right. And yeah, this is key. The model maximizes, assuming that what the farmers believe is optimal. It doesn't really need to be optimal from a purely agronomic point of view. But what we observe, and when we are calibrating our net revenue function, we are not calibrating it for what farmers should be doing. We calibrate it for what farmers do, which is more important from the standpoint of the simulation. Even if they are not actually doing what is optimal, in their head it is, and it might be a bad decision. But the surface of the calibration that we are developing does not reflect what plants should be doing in terms of the agronomic optimalities, what farmers do. And there might be a bad decision, and farmers might learn eventually, and then those parameters will change. But the optimality is based on on the farmer belief more than on the agronomic optimality. So yeah, so it could be a bad decision. It's actually not optimal. They could have done better. But this farmer believes it's optimal. The parameters capture that behavior surface, if you will. And yeah, and they might go out of business thinking that they are optimal, or in the retrospect that may learn that they are not. Our model is capturing also those this bad behavior, right, in terms of the decision making at the farm scale.
Captures it by the repeated recalculation.
Exactly, by repeated, it goes over time. It's just seen again and again, like what they do, and what they see is what they do, not what they should be doing. So the farmer and the production function is not capturing the agronomic, the physiology of the plant is capturing the behavior of the farmer, and this is what makes the model so interesting.
So
Yeah.
you are a Montana model, right? That what you've done is a Montana, and how much can we jump this to other places? For instance, with similar environments, can we move it to Argentina, where we have some areas that are climatically similar, and I presume using similar crops?
Mm-hmm. We could. The limitation is that we use the Cropland Data layer that is only available for the conterminous US. But I was talking to the USDA, the Foreign Agricultural Service, and they're developing a global scale, a crop layer, a classification. And then absolutely, yes. Yeah, so South America, Africa, and start looking into issues of food security and famine. Yeah, those are like really interesting questions that hopefully will be open with this methodology, if they produce that global layer for crops.
Great, thank you, Marco. This was excellent.
Thank you.